Fort Ellis was a combination infantry and cavalry post located 3 miles east of Bozeman, Montana, right at the edge of settlement. Montana was settled from the west to the east instead of east to west. And it was created in 1867 to protect the settlers of the agricultural valley as well as the minefields in western Montana. In 1867, there was a little bit of conflict between the Native Americans and settlers going along the Bozeman Trail. The Bozeman Trail was a cutoff of the Oregon Trail. It was kind of a shortcut founded by a gentleman by the name of John Bozeman, who made a cutoff across central Wyoming into Montana to the gold fields. And the Sioux weren't particularly fond of this trail because of the number of settlers that were going back and forth across it. There were a series of posts along there. And in 1866, there was a pretty substantial war coming right at the heels of the Civil War. The Civil War had just ended, and this was a fairly major investment to protect the trail by the U.S. Army, which was downsizing at the time. And the settlers of Bozeman the town had been established in about 1864, just as the trail had been established. And they saw themselves as a great opportunity to sell goods and services to travelers that were just coming off of the trail just before they'd get to the minefields. And there was the Gallatin Valley is a very agriculturally rich valley, and unlike most settlements in Montana at that time, which were centered around gold mining, Bozeman was an agricultural settlement. So they saw themselves as being able to be a cornucopia of goods for settlers that had just made this arduous journey. Well, the Sioux started to attack in 1866. And the Sioux and Cheyenne started to attack, and they really wanted the trail to be closed as they saw this was an intrusion upon their land. And there were a number of forts along the way, Fort Phil Kearny being the largest and most substantial. And there was a pretty sustained effort against the cavalry and the settlers, and it became very, very dangerous to settle it. At the same time, in the spring of 1867, the settlers of Bozeman were very concerned about the hostilities along the trail coming into the valley. And then it happened that John Bozeman, who is the founder of the trail as well as the founder of the town of Bozeman, which they called Bozeman City at the time, he was traveling with a friend, Thomas Cover, across into the Yellowstone River Valley, across the mountains in the Yellowstone River Valley, which is by modern-day Livingston, and was killed. And it was purported that he was killed by Indians, although most modern scholars think that he was killed by either Thomas Cover or someone else, another white person. And when he was killed, there was a great panic in the territory as a whole, but especially in and around Bozeman. The governor of Montana, a gentleman by the name of Thomas Mayer, besieged Lieutenant General Sherman to raise a militia because they all assumed that the Indians were going to be flooding into the valley to attack the settlement at any time. Sherman always was somewhat reluctant to give in to this kind of pressure, but Thomas Mayer had been the commander of the Irish Brigade during the Civil War, and so he had military experience, at least knew Sherman on a professional level, and very reluctantly allowed Mayer to authorize a militia to be formed and be reimbursed by the U.S. government. The militia was formed. Nothing ever really happened, except for the settlers of Bozeman made themselves over $500,000 off of overcharging the government for goods and services. But Sherman, always somewhat skeptical of Mayer and what was going on in the West, sent a captain by the name of E.W. Cliff to check out what was going on. In addition, he started rethinking his strategy of the Bozeman Trail and whether or not it was worth the investment to protect. And so by the fall of 1867, Sherman decided on two things. One, the Bozeman Trail needed to be abandoned. It was no longer feasible to effectively protect it, and both economically as well as perhaps, it just was unnecessarily provocative. Secondly, that there was enough settlement, at least in and around Bozeman and further to the west of Bozeman in the minefields, that a new military fort needed to be established. And so in 1867, he sent 2 companies of infantry, 13th U.S. Infantry, to create a fort in the eastern part of the Gallatin Valley, which became known as Fort Ellis. At first, they were a little bit unhappy about it. They saw the monetary flow of goods coming off of the settlers off the Bozeman Trail being closed. And one individual by the name of Peter Koch said the Bozeman Trail was closed and Fort Ellis became the gatekeeper. And they were very unhappy about that. I don't think it took them long to realize that there was money to be had in selling goods and services to soldiers, however. And that money was probably more steady than the settlers that would come seasonally. Soldiers were there all the time. Throughout its history, there's any number of examples of where they take advantage of the soldiers by selling them goods or by gambling, in some cases gambling with soldiers for military equipment, which the soldiers then get court-martialed for because they weren't supposed to let that goods go, but they've been gambling and selling alcohol, selling goods, services. The people of Bozeman were upset with the people at Fort Ellis for not spending more money in town, and the soldiers would respond in the newspaper, well, then don't charge so much money for goods that we can get imported from the east. By November of that year, the post commander was pretty unhappy with the people of Bozeman and actually declared war on them twice. He sent one company of soldiers to an establishment and literally razed it to the ground because, as he said, they were in the habit of furnishing intoxicating liquors to the command of this post against orders. 2 days later, he sent troops into town to ransack. He didn't actually destroy it, but at least according to the orders. But the orders state that they were to ransack and destroy the establishment of a gentleman by the name of Colonel Chestnut, who presumably, even though it was a little vague, was somehow involved with military action in the Civil War recently over, and destroy all the liquor as well as furnishings within his establishment. So it seems very early on the settlers realized that there was money to be had. Sioux more or less seemed to accept the reality of the fort being, or the trail being abandoned and the fort being there. There were always occasional skirmishes. Now, the Gallatin Valley is unique in that no tribes really claimed it as their own. They had crossed it, especially the Nez Perce and Bannock and Flatheads would cross the Gallatin Valley and come to the Yellowstone River Valley to hunt, but then would return. But no tribe seemed to have lived there. And so the Sioux and Cheyenne were perfectly content now that the trail was gone. But the tribes from the farther west would come and they would travel across the valley, and that always created a level of conflict where the white settlers, and you can read it in the newspaper accounts very vividly, where they use blatantly racist terms to describe them, and always a level of concern, and the settlers are always seemingly very, very concerned about all Indians, regardless of what their tribes were. And occasionally stock would be stolen, especially horses, but even some other stock. There might be the occasional little skirmish and whatnot. And what was really interesting was that they would exaggerate this, and they would write newspaper accounts about this incredibly large Indian fight, and there was, it was going to be a huge battle coming up, and that there needs to be more troops, always needs to be more troops at Fort Ellis. But the commanders of the fort would write to the governors or to their superiors, which were in Minneapolis, and say, no, don't believe these reports. At most, it was one person having a little confrontation. Nobody was killed. It was just an exchange of fire. The reports are wholly false. And so it's real interesting to look at how the soldiers responded to these purported attacks versus what the civilians thought of them. The largest confrontations happened in 1875. The settlers of Bozeman were always waiting for the Northern Pacific Railroad to make its way, which would come out of, it had ended at Bismarck, and they had surveyed the land coming from Bismarck, and they were always anxiously waiting for it to arrive because it would connect them to the eastern markets. Well, there was a huge economic collapse in 1873 nationwide. There's an economic collapse partially due to overextension of some of the rail companies. And the Northern Pacific Railroad stopped temporarily its advance. Well, this caused the settlers of Bozeman all sorts of great concern. So they wanted to open the Yellowstone River Valley, and they organized what was called the Yellowstone Wagon Road and Prospecting Expedition, which was to go find gold ostensibly. But it's very fascinating that there seems to be a subtext that they wanted to provoke an Indian battle to clear the land of Indians in the Yellowstone River Valley so that the railroad could come through. They thought that that the Indians were the ones that were stopping the advance of the railroad, who really it was much more economic, but perception becomes its own reality. And so they organized this wagon expedition of about 100 or so people that were going to leave Bozeman, cross the mountains, come down into the Yellowstone River Valley, and establish themselves by the mouth of the Bighorn River, which everybody knew. Everybody knew that this was Indian territory, and there was south of the Yellowstone River was the Crow Indian Reservation, but they knew that this was going to provoke the Sioux and the Cheyenne as well. They went so far as to ask the settler or the soldiers at the fort, "Are you going to stop us?" And there's a level of correspondence between the commander of the fort at that time, which was temporary. They were kind of in between commanders, so there was a commander there, a temporary commander by the name of Captain Benham of the 13th U.S. Infantry, and he wrote to his superiors in St. Paul asking, "Should I stop them? I don't think I should. I assume not, based on previous correspondence that I found in our files here. So I told them, no, I'm not going to, but if I'm supposed to, please let me know." And the soldiers head off, or the civilians head off into the Yellowstone Valley, and there are a number of skirmishes along the way. But they keep writing letters back and forth to Bozeman, and they're published in the newspaper at the time. And there's one particularly interesting letter that's written back to the it was the Avant Courier is what it was called, and it was very interesting in that they say something to the effect, and I'll just paraphrase that we hear that a war has begun with the Indians, and that relieves us so much because now we're saved the responsibility of starting it. And, so it seems that they were intentionally being provocative in this whole thing, especially because the chances of gold where they were going to go was pretty slim anyway. Eventually, they are attacked, and a number of their people were wounded. Some fled back to Bozeman. Some stayed in the stockade that they had built there. And they wrote back asking for help. And ultimately, by January of 1876, the War Department has decided that the Sioux problem needed to be, as they called it, the Sioux problem needed to be solved, and that the Indians had a deadline to go back to the reservations or they were to face military action. And they gave orders to the commander at Fort Ellis to move his troops out to relieve the people at Fort Pease, which they did. They brought the civilians from Fort Pease back to Bozeman. All while that's going on in Washington, D.C., and in the various military departments of the West, they are preparing the Great Sioux War, which is to force the Indians back on the reservation, which results then in the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, but then also the Battle of the Rosebud. There's other battles that ultimately culminate in the surrender of Sitting Bull, or Sitting Bull actually fleeing to Canada, and Crazy Horse being surrendering by the following winter, or winter of the following year. It shut down in 1886, ironically, at the behest of civilians in Bozeman. It was taking up quite a big area of land in the West Marion. It's a very, very fertile valley, and so settlers, the railroad had come through in 1884, and so people were very, very happy that the railroad was there. And so now there's a new economic bloodline for the citizens, and they wanted to have that military reservation opened up, and they petitioned the government to close the fort and open up the reservation. What's really interesting is Sherman was always looking to close forts, but it does not appear. In fact, it's quite clear that Fort Ellis was never on his chopping block. He wanted to keep Fort Ellis because it would be a great supply fort for new forts that had been established further east, and especially right there in the middle of the agricultural heartland of the Gallatin Valley. And so he doesn't seem to have been interested in closing the fort, but when he gets that, it's a moment of opportunity, because every time he tried to close a fort, there would be a local uproar, just like there is today when you hear about fort closing. They're, "Oh no, we can't. We need that job. It's too important. We can't do it." He wasn't going to turn the opportunity down, and so he closed it down. One lady in Bozeman who had been married to an officer at Fort Ellis and then returned to Bozeman to live said, well, they soon regretted their decision. But it doesn't really seem that they did. The newspapers seem to suggest that, hey, we're happy that this land now is going to be open to settlement. And the Helena Herald, which was a little ways away, but said, they congratulated Bozeman on the closing of the fort, and which now the land will be much more productive and will bring more to the thriving little settlement than a small two-company post would do. The book, in my opinion, is designed for them to be able to draw their own conclusions, which is the professor in me coming out, I suppose. I want them to see the evidence and draw their own conclusions. But what I'd really like them to see is that it's not as simple as the government being an economic stimulus. That there was, once they got the dollars, the people in Bozeman were competing amongst themselves viciously as well for those dollars, that they weren't the rugged individualistic frontier settlers that were free of all government interference out here in the West. They saw that money as, in fact, very important, and they saw it as the duty of the military to stimulate their economy, and the government, by extension, to stimulate their economy. And so it kind of busts through some of those rugged individual frontier myths, and to see that. But then also that there was both a level of affinity between the soldiers and civilians, but then there's also some conflict there. Again, subtle and not so subtle, even to the point where they did kind of disagree about what should be done about the Indians. It's very interesting to look at the level of panic that the settlers seem to feel reading their accounts versus the soldiers, which are like, I'm in this tough situation. These guys want action. I don't think it's justified. Also, and there's one that's really interesting. One Lara says, I'm kind of in this weird position because I'm supposed to protect the civilians from the Indians, but I'm also kind of supposed to protect the Indians from the civilians. And so it's a much more complex relationship than certainly what we see in Hollywood Westerns.